Hello, and welcome to our event, Regaining Trust, Identity Politics During Elections. This is your host, Izabela from the Open Gov Hub. We are a dynamic meeting place in Washington, D.C., with 50-member organizations that work together to open up governments and empower citizens worldwide. Together with our co-founder, Global Integrity, we have organized a three-part event series focusing on polarization and democratic crises prior to the 2020 US elections. This series is building on our previous Defending Democracy work and an ongoing initiative of GI called Outside In, which applies global democracy lessons to address governance challenges in the United States. If you missed our previous events covering journalism and polarization or election risks, please see below for the links. The third and final event in our series is on political identity and what it means to regain trust during and after the elections. I am super delighted to have with us here today 4 speakers. Silas Kulkarni, who is the Senior Fellow for Public Discourse at Braver Angels, Petros Vamvakas, Associate Professor of Political Science at Emmanuel College in Boston, Kavita Pavria-Sanchez, Civil Rights Attorney, Policy Analyst and Co-founder of KPS Strategies, as well as Priya Kvam, the Associate Director for Strategic Partnerships and Initiatives at Breakthrough based in New York City. The 2 lead questions for our guests at the roundtable are: what are the main drivers behind polarizing political identities from your perspective? And how can we repair the social fabric and regain trust in government? Starting with Silas.
And all these identities overlapping means that we are around people who are like us. We talk only to people who are like us. And in addition to that, we the dispositions that we have, the ideological bents, which might not necessarily map to policy preferences, but are just sort of a way of understanding and engaging the universe, have now been associated with these intrinsic qualities of our identity, making them much more heated. So I would just really recommend to the audience to explore those 2 books, which talk about why that's happened. And one third I'll recommend is the scholar Lee Drutman has a book called Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop. But one of the things he argues there is that we actually functionally had a 4-party system in the US previously because of the conservative and liberal wings of both Republican and Democratic parties. And now we've gotten to the point where the Democratic Party is entirely the Liberal Party and the Republican Party is entirely the Conservative Party. The negotiations that were possible there no longer function, and that's not ideally suited to a country like ours that has divided government for most of the time as it is currently. So a lot more to say there, but I'll pause there and pass to some of the other speakers who could probably say much more and better than I could.
Well, I think that's a tall order. I don't know if I can do that. I mean, I can give you my perspective, but I don't know if I can do better than that. I have more like a bird's eye view of, of where we are, why we are where we are. And in some ways, I like to think I'm a cynical and optimist, not necessarily a pessimist in my approach, but you guys will be the judge of that, and we can pick up the conversation. But I think, in the last 30 years, we've been fascinated with this idea of liberal democracy and the post-Cold War world where, everybody was celebrating our way of life, so to speak, and we saw it play itself out in different ways. And at the same time, we were already picking up on the radar. There were issues as far as social trust was concerned. Even back in the 1990s, people like Putnam were raising the flag as far as, making democracy work and the importance of social trust and social collateral in that way. I think both of these things really have come to converge to really create cycles of polarization in this country, but not only in this country, in the rest of the world as well. So, going back to Putnam's work at the time, making democracy work was referring to Italy, and bowling alone that came afterwards was not just referring to the United States, but to advanced democracies at the same time. That the same pattern of losing social trust was happening across the globe in advanced democracies, that it wasn't just an issue of transferability of democracy that everybody was enamored with in the 1990s in that peace dividend that we were going to get after the Cold War, but people like Putnam were saying, even in advanced democracies, we have an erosion of social trust. We have an erosion in our institutions. We have an erosion in our associations. People are not making those private associations any longer. So we had picked it up. Social scientists had picked that up in the radar. And even the Bush administration that, was talking about the faith-based initiatives and things of that sort, or changing the architecture of cities to really create that front yard or backyard kind of like neighborhood potluck dinners idea of how do we bring society together. But the first piece, the liberal aspect, I think is more detrimental to our democracy. And I really question the fact whether liberal democracy can coexist, whether those two terms can coexist together. The idea of liberalism is the idea of free market and free choice. The idea of utilitarianism is inherent in liberalism. Cost-benefit analysis. How do I maximize what I get out of every exchange? And I think that has really poisoned the democratic side of the equation, because democracy works on the idea of citizenship, not the idea of consumerism. Democracy works on the idea of sacrifice, of immediate sacrifice for the common good. That is not part of some kind of a utility function. The utility function would look at something like this as irrational. Why would you sacrifice your ultimate benefit for some kind of a common good that would be to your detriment? That is a consumer, not necessarily the citizen. And I think we have gradually moved in this way in the last 30 years, from administration to administration in this country. We certainly have seen that. We've seen, like going back to the Bush administration, again, this private ownership society where we privatize things like social goods, healthcare, education, retirement, even things of like, even things like water or air become, market goods. Everything, food has become a market good. There's no such thing as a social good any longer. And that really has taken us somewhere else. Now, in addendum to this, which leads us to the polarization of today, is the free market system is inherently competitive. The free market system is inherently leads to inequalities. Wherever we have had orthodox liberalism at play, whether it's in the 19th century or the early part of the 20th century, we run into bubbles, we run into inequalities, we run into Great Depressions, we run into inability for everybody to access. Everybody aspires to be in the winning circle, but we know there's only very few winners and many losers. And it's not accidental that in societies, the people that are marginalized to begin with in societies or cannot access education, cannot access healthcare, are the ones that are really become the losers of the overall system. It's the same pattern in the United States. It takes the racial gender characteristics of the United States, but we can transfer this elsewhere as well, because with the implementation of liberalism, we've also had all kinds of elimination of the social gaps that were providing the welfare for a lot of the people that were marginalized, including unions, including all kinds of government assistance and help. So we're seeing the same pattern in Italy. We're seeing the same pattern in Spain, in Portugal, in Greece, and even in the Scandinavian countries. The Scandinavian countries, which were at the forefront of the social welfare system, you have countries like Sweden and Norway, who in the beginning of the 2000s begin to look to the American model, right? The new Europe kind of a thing, right? The Rumsfeld Europe kind of a thing, where you look at, the Sarkozys and the Merkels that become like sort of like looking to the American model of how the American model is efficient, how the American model can compete in the global market. So we focused on the market, we've left the society behind, and now we are reaping the benefits or the outcomes, if you wish, of this kind of a construct. And by its nature, we have created two very polarized entities in all of these democracies, and we have a really dysfunctioning institutional democratic structure in many of these advanced democracies, I think. That's it. I don't have anything else for now.
Kavita, I think you're next.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so just some thoughts to share. And Petros, I feel like you set the stage for a lot of what I wanted to say. So I'll start by saying that My background or my journey begins with working in the grassroots with South Asian communities facing deportation and detention. So really, the most vulnerable of at least my community in this country, and so I always go back there as perspective on how do you think about these issues, not from my position of privilege. And so I think what I'll say is that I think talking about identity politics, talking about minority groups, is just tokenistic, right? Doesn't resonate. There isn't depth there, and I think it comes from a place of desperation of folks who are running or are elected officials now, without doing that work of really getting to know vulnerable communities. It's not often intersectional, and therefore, I think resonates with some, but doesn't go deep enough to get to the root causes of what is actually happening in this country and has been happening since its founding. So I think instead, what I would say is that the AOCs, let's say Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, for those who aren't from this country, are talking about class struggle. Which is, I think, a central source of oppression in this country. I think, Petros, you indirectly alluded to it, which I appreciate, and is fundamental, right? To name capitalism and the winners and the losers, as you said, and how there is a possibility for a different kind of economy that looks at class struggle, that looks at how class really is the defining aspect, I think, of most of our experiences as it relates to the economy and our survival. And then you kind of layer on that race, gender, ability, and all of the other dimensions of our lives that intersectionally contribute to how we are faring in this country, and how we connect with the social fabric of this country. And so I'll move there with that, right? So how do you have a different kind of social fabric? And how do you have that now, right? We're not dismantling capitalism anytime soon. We're not building a brand new economy. But I think what we do have the chance to do here in this moment, and has been happening in the last couple of years under Trump, is incorporate civic engagement into the social fabric, right? To give folks a way to build power, whether that's through supporting elected officials or mobilizing around Election Day. I think that's been a real gift or a lesson from this horrible time under Trump, is that folks have woken up and are more interested in civic engagement in a diverse in diverse forms. And I think we've noticed, I don't know if this is the case for others, but every single friend in my admitted bubble is doing voter engagement in some way. So we do have this new reality, and I think Izabela, I think, really pulled out for me just a question around how do we locate that in the fact that we have this deeply conservative Supreme Court, right? That's sort of the most recent development that threatens our democracy, in my view. And with that as the reality, I think, the initial reaction is that this is hopeless, and we have years and years ahead of us of very, very devastating decisions coming down on critical issues to democracy. However, I think what it does, one gift again that I see of that sort of devastating reality, I wouldn't choose it, but there is some potential here, which is motivating folks in the way that folks have been motivated under Trump to build the power of our most impacted communities to fight for change within the House and Senate, and all other kind of democratic institutions where that is possible, and to win seats. And then I think that's just really 1%, right, of the potential here. But I did want to lift that up, just as something that has been breaking and very, very difficult to grapple with for many folks in the last couple of weeks. So I will pause there and pass it over to Priya.
Thank you, Kavita. It's really interesting to hear all of your reflections. And I'm not a political scientist or a scholar of comparative politics, so the perspective I can offer is the perspective of media makers, culture makers. I think, just to echo what you said about intersectional identities and the superficiality of some of the identity politics we're seeing now, there is power, certainly, in building movements grounded in shared lived experiences. But if we are disconnecting the axes of our identities, then there's absolutely, a crippling of what could be movement building, around issues, because issue organizing is different from identity politics that is grounded in a very, very narrow interpretation of who we are. I think that, this has been happening since time immemorial, and an example that I wanted to draw out is from the book Carnal Knowledge and Imperial Power by Anne Stoler. She talks about social classification as something that is not a benign cultural act. And she's looking at the late 19th century and early 20th century in what is now Indonesia, Malaysia, in colonial empires, where creating colonial categories and distinguishing the rulers from the ruled was intrinsically tied to intimacy, to who could love who could organize in the social ladder, and how we then claimed ourselves as white, as other. We see that today, and we see identity politics as something that emerged really as originally a critique from the right of the left, and now it's crossed the political spectrum. We have a lot of white grievance that is coming up. And when we look at the drivers in 2020 of these polarized political identities, economic disempowerment, political disenfranchisement, whether it's real or whether it's feared, a lack of checks and balances in political systems. Of course, what's happening with the judiciary in the United States is really alarming for that reason. And then media narratives. We're seeing deliberate misinformation and also an erosion of media that is local, that is public service oriented journalism. When local news desks are taken over by big conglomerates, those desks are among the first to go. And those are the ones that are really oriented towards stories that are about public goods, as opposed to what Petros was saying in terms of market goods. And we know that the private sector has a role to play in this too. There was a book released last year by Anand Giridharadas called Winners Take All, which was really calling out big business and big philanthropy for its role in eroding trust in government. When you have the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world saying, well, government is ineffectual, they've also played a role in crippling those governments because of this phenomenon of stagnating wages, of the uber rich, of aggregating power on the part of big business, big philanthropy, so that the McKinseys and the Ford Foundations of the world can come in and say, hey, we have innovative solutions. We are actually here to save you and serve you, as opposed to government, as opposed to the United Nations. Don't believe in multilateralism. Don't invest in those old ways of doing things. And that certainly frays the social fabric even more. And we know at Breakthrough that there's enormous power in personal storytelling, in first-person narratives that really go to the heart of what people experience. first-person experiences have the power to spark empathy, to build movements, to really restore that trust, because you're building bridges across people. You know, we talk about our work serving Midwestern white suburban moms, but also serving, you know, gender nonconforming Gen Z youth in New York City. And how can we tell stories and hold space for people across those spectrums of identity, so that we can actually come together, recognizing our shared humanity and using empathy as that thread. And, you know, accountability is huge. Obviously, the accountability has to be there in the media and the storytelling on the part of government. And we really have to make sure that we're investing in those public services, whether it is through storytelling, whether it is through government services, through social safety nets, in order to reassure people that that we're together on a trajectory, which is about meeting their needs, restoring safety and well-being, and giving them hope for the future.
Thank you all so much. I'm just popping back in to move us along. And if you want to respond to anything that another panelist said, please do. We have about 10 minutes for that. And in the meantime, I'm going to launch a quick poll on what our audience thinks are the most polarizing factors. And I'll leave the very hard job to you to solve how we can bridge these gaps. And I think some of this has already come along during the discussion. Also, if you would like to participate in the fishbowl, please use the Q&A box to enter a question or a topic that you'd like to discuss with our speakers.
And so, Izabela, just to be clear, the panelists are discussing among each other currently on the questions you gave us. Okay, great. So I wanted to jump in on the question of repairing the social fabric and regaining trust in government, which was our second discussion question, because I think it connects very directly to what you were saying, Priya, about the power of first-person narrative, and what you were saying, Petros, about this idea of social isolation and some of these ideas from Putnam about people not having just association in a public space anymore. One of the things that, so Braver Angels, my organization, approaches this from a very relational perspective. And so we have these chapters all over the country that literally just bring people together across the partisan divide and have them engage in like actual listening exercises. They're literally modeled after marital therapy. And so you can see these workshops where people have to listen and then say, so it sounds like you're saying this. Am I hearing you correctly? Which, you know, it's a remarkable when somebody does that, how much more they will hear from the other person because they're being forced to, you know, actually listen. And you can watch these videos if you go on our website and these people have these transformative experiences. It matches intuitively what you would think would happen, but there's also data on this. For example, Pew did some research about if you have friends of the other party, how much more or less negative your opinions will be towards them. And those people who have a lot or even some friends of the opposite party will have literally twice as many, or half as much negative opinion towards the other party as those who have no such friends. And so just the very act of making a human connection in the first place, hearing somebody's story and understanding why they're there is a beginning step on this. And that's a huge part of what we do as an organization, is build these community groups that do that. And then we do that in public spaces, for example, having a debate where you have people of different viewpoints who are engaging not in a sort of point scoring way, but an actual listening way. We believe that that's part of this underlying civic fabric, that there's a huge set of policy factors that flow out of polarization, but if you can't have that baseline level of trust, those will seem to widen over time, in our opinion. So, but I would love to hear others' opinions on that. Particularly if you disagree, I'm very open to that, because I think that some people might say that that's not the starting point.
Yeah, all right. I just can't help but think, but this is still like an esoteric kind of a conversation that we're having. So, like, you know, in many ways. So I did this recently. I did this trip from, like, you know, Lawrence, Mass to Laredo, Texas, and I went specifically to Latino or Hispanic majority communities in the United States as part of a course that I teach on the politics of race and ethnicity in Latin America. And because of COVID, we couldn't travel to Latin America as a class. I drove across the country, and I had my classes from these 12 communities. So when I went to Chelsea, Massachusetts, which is right across Boston itself, and Tobin Bridge is the one that connects Chelsea and Boston, you find out that 80% of the people in Chelsea, Mass, work like, they're essential workers. That means they can't stay home during COVID. That means most of them get paid cash, or even like, if this COVID is detected, they can't be tracked because they have multiple jobs at multiple times. Most of those people take public transportation. Most of those people live like in places that they cannot be socially distanced. They live in 3-deckers and could be multi-generational. So a lot of the conversations that we're having as far as the polarization is concerned and engaging people it doesn't even resonate when people who are just trying to make a living. And you have like, you can even look at things like median income, or you can look at things like, population density. Central Falls, Rhode Island, 1 square mile, 19,000 people. The biggest employer there is an ICE detention center. Langley Park, Maryland, less than 1 square mile. Most immigrants from Guatemala, 20,000 people live there. There isn't really any kind of a lawn sign that says Black Lives Matter or I believe in science or any of those things that I see in the lawns in Newton, Massachusetts. None of the communities that I went to had any lawn signs whatsoever that had to do with a national politics. In Central Falls, Rhode Island, you might see some signs that have to do with the local mayoral race, but that's about it. So I think in some ways we are speaking on this level, in an academic level, and then there's another discourse somewhere else. And I think the last 2 administrations are very indicative of this. You have the former academic Obama, in one sense, speaking to academics or in the Beltway or in the Boston 128 area. And then you have this sort of like televangelist reality star Trump, who speaks in a very American, he speaks American. He doesn't speak English. He speaks American, right? He speaks about the minute you go 27 miles west of Dallas Airport, you see 3 giant crosses and 3 huge American flags intertwined. And then once you go to Lehigh, Virginia, you see a large Confederate flag on Route 81, right onto Route 40. And from that point on, all the way to New Mexico, you don't see a single billboard that does not have President Trump, an American flag, some reference to God, or some kind of a, God and country altogether. I think those discourses are so far apart. I don't know, like about, how marriage therapy would bridge that, but it's not even the same language anymore as far as that the societies that we live in, I mean, I just sometimes, people, I keep thinking that, the Democrats, you're talking about the Supreme Court, what a disaster it is today. This has been a strategic depth going back to the Reagan years of the moral majority and taking the airwaves with Rush Limbaugh. This is something that they have cultivated for 30 to 40 years, and this is the fruition of it. I mean, mission accomplished. To borrow like from George W. Bush, this is mission accomplished. Trump has finished the job that they started in 1973. And I think it would take the same kind of a concerted effort within the framework of American politics for the Democrats or for somebody else to reverse it. But first we have to realize it. And I think, we have to realize that we have a systemic issue, not just trying to fix it within the system itself.
I'm so eager to engage that question, but I also am deeply cognizant of the importance of all voices being heard. So I'm going to defer for a moment.
I'll jump in with a couple of memories, because I think you're absolutely right that there are these levels, and bringing it to the personal, to the human, is so important. At Breakthrough, we talk about this idea that human rights begin with you. Human rights are often talked about on this esoteric level in terms of nation states and the international system and the social contract that we have, at that level. But we are individual people who are catalysts of change. We are the people who have, rights to and freedoms from. And the ways that we actually recognize that in our lived experiences, the ways that we own them as a part of our being, that's powerful. And I think that, our sense of dislocation is, the grievances are real. recognizing also that there are things that are papered over the reality. We can talk about Trump's America and the way that the discourse has so changed from Obama's America. And you can talk about, coal miners in West Virginia, and you can talk about AI and the replacement of people who are actually working jobs with robots and modern technology. But if you're avoiding the systemic issues, if you're avoiding the fact that there was a biracial president of the United States and a Black family in the White House, in a house built by slaves, you are missing the point. There is so much vitriol that has been generated by this sense of being wronged because of this history, centuries long. 1619, right, was the arrival of the first slave ship on American shores. Centuries of feeling like we, the people in power, were owed that power. And so how do you hold space for that feeling? Because that feeling is very real, it's very visceral. And something that we try to do at Breakthrough is to call people in rather than call them out. Because if you're new to the movement for Black lives, if you're new to the movement for marriage equality, you shouldn't be penalized for that. And you can't actually grow the power of that movement if you're making people feel badly for not having connected with that lived experience before. Something we're doing with our election campaign right now is talking to young folks between the ages of 16 and 24, especially young folks of color, and holding space for them to share what their fears are, what their concerns are, their opinions, even if those opinions are alarming to other people, even if those opinions aren't necessarily PC, because we are a progressive human rights organization, doesn't mean that we can't hold space for them. And I was reading the results of a survey that we've disseminated, and one of the survey takers said, I'm not voting in this election because the candidates at the top of each ticket are both white supremacists. Okay, that is your feeling, that is an opinion that is probably the result of our media narrative. We could look at how we reframe that media narrative, but it doesn't mean that it's not valid. And I think that, another point I want to highlight is that this notion of the us versus them, I remember it being so obvious in the wake of 9/11. I had been living in India for 3 years during middle school and had come back to the States in August of 2003 and noticed American flags everywhere. Bumper stickers, gas stations, McDonald's, everywhere. There was this explosion of, pride in America in a way that was very aggressive. That was, the nation was attacked. Therefore, we, close ranks and we reaffirm our commitment to this thing that is bigger than us. But, the flag was papering over, again, racism, xenophobia, anti-Muslim rhetoric. There was so much there that purported to be universal and purported to be calling people in, but actually was just a cover for what we've seen as, this rise in very anti-democratic practices on the part of government, and this barbell effect in our identity politics and our political system.
Yes, thank you so much. We're going to move to the next thing, but before we do, I'm going to share the poll results right now. And the number one polarizing factor that our audience has brought to our attention are the socioeconomic factors at 54%, closely followed by racial and ethnic identity, and at 50%, and your gender or age at 29%. I'm going to leave these up for a little bit. But moving into the Q&A fishbowl section, I am going to bring in one person who just asked a question, and I'll let him ask it live. It's Paul. So Paul, I'm going to upgrade you to a panelist in a moment, and then you can discuss this live for about 5 minutes. And he's talking about building on the structural systemic piece highlighted by Petros and the local civil underscored by Silas. How do we as Americans seek to translate the common ground and shared identity we're exploring at the civil society level? So All right, Paul, you are being promoted to panelist. Welcome to the fishbowl.
Hey everyone, this is my name is Paul Kuhne. I'm the Roundtables Program Manager with Center for Open Data Enterprise, but also, admittedly, I'll out myself now as also a volunteer with Braver Angels, so I may be taking Silas's tact a little bit more on this. But I also have studied political science and public policy, and so Petros, I think a lot of the comments you were making certainly resonate. And I think the thing that I wanted just to kind of bring into the discussion, and it's been really fascinating so far, is trying to bridge the divide between the local and the civil society, and these divides that you're really highlighting very well, Petros. I mean, this past weekend I was camping in Virginia, or West Virginia rather, and you drive out and there's immediate, there are American flags everywhere, Trump signs everywhere. And my friend actually commented, I feel like, driving through this area, I almost feel like a stranger in my own land, which is ironic because that was the title of the book that came out describing folks working down on the Gulf and feeling kind of left behind by a national government and a narrative that often didn't include them. And while I think there's been a lot of structural factors that have taken place over the last 3 to 4 decades that we've all been highlighting here, and whether it's a little bit of democratic backsliding and sort of shifting of norms, or not really actively respecting precedent in terms of what the political decorum should be, I do think the work of national identity building and thinking about how civil society translates a lot of these conversations and crossing those divides. So whether it's, going into spaces and having a conversation in a church and talking about issues related to immigration, or issues related to, gun control, or topics that are often just really can be really, really third rails in American politics. But I want to kind of understand how we think there's a way of taking this civil society energy, and we as citizens, in a very discursive way of trying to identify what a new American identity is, and how, me as a progressive, I would like to fly the American flag very proudly outside my own house and have my own ability to talk about that and share that with my conservative friends. But I do think that there has to be a way of connecting and linking the institutional to the civil society. And Ezra Klein talks about that, why we're polarized. There's sort of this negative feedback loop that keeps happening with media elites and political institutions pulling on the polarization they're seeing in civil society, and then us in turn getting more polarized because we're reading these same papers and finding ourselves feeling more and more aggravated. And I think that there is probably a way to transform or scale what's going on at the civil society level into something a lot more powerful at the institutional level. So I don't know. I know it's kind of a hodgepodge of ideas, but I'm curious what the panel might have to say about linking the civil society level. And I'm not really saying like necessarily like from a media-driven approach, but linking sort of a new American common identity and purpose to what it means at the institutional level. So that's kind of my question.
Yeah, I mean, I can start, I guess. I don't know how radical you want me to be. I think you have to deconstruct to reconstruct. I don't think you can, soft land this at all. First of all, you have to attack the American exceptionalism argument, that both sides have this inherent American exceptionalism. The progressives think that they are exceptional in some way. They have the higher ground, the higher moral ground. And I think in many ways, progressives in this country have lost themselves in some aisle at Whole Foods looking for quinoa and avocados, right? On the other end, right, we have completely deconstructed the ideas of what it means to be a citizen and civil engagement. Americans fundamentally don't understand what civics is all about. Americans don't understand that civics means not, I'm against volunteering, for instance. I'm fundamentally against volunteering. If you're in a state, you have duties that go with your responsibilities, right? You shouldn't just have rights. You also have duties. And on purpose in this country, we have been divorced from our duties and responsibilities and have become subjective participants and think that by voting, we go and we just rubber stamp decisions and say, come out and vote, when I don't necessarily have any kind of a particular voice. Political participation does not begin and end with voting. It does not begin and end with just like having some ink on my thumb, the way that we are supposedly teaching the uncivilized barbarians in Iraq and Afghanistan and in El Salvador as we did in the 1980s. Participation in a civic engagement means I have a duty. I should be pro-taxes. I should be pro-service. That's part of my duty. And then we can begin to talk about democracy. But we're not talking about democracy at all. All we're talking about is liberalism, entitlement, and we paper over it with some democratic rhetoric. We put some Greek columns on top of it, and then we celebrate it, and then we begin to identify some of this. Most of these issues, like I said earlier, do not, I mean, if you are in any of these communities, if you went to El Paso today, or if you went to Laredo today, none of this conversation will have any relevance to people there. It means absolutely nothing. And a private, I found this out 2 weeks ago, and it just blows my mind. A private in the US military makes $17,000 a year. A soldier in the US military, $17,000 a year, and they pay $400 a month for rent. This person will die wrapped around the flag, because that flag is also part of that exceptionalism. Our exceptionalism is intellectual and civilizing. That exceptionalism is flag waving and some kind of an association with the flag, the same type of exceptionalism, right? So we have to take down the exceptionalism first and then realize what democracy really means, and then begin to have a conversation. So I think it will take first at the identification and then the reconstruction moving forward.
Yeah, thank you.
And that wasn't the radical version either. So.
Oh, I know the
I
radical.
want to hear that. I want to hear that version.
Yeah, Kavita, do you have anything to add before we move to the next fishbowl question, since we have only 10 minutes left? And
I'm
for
good.
disclosure, Professor Vamvakas was my former professor in college, so I know all the awesome radically changing views that hopefully can, make our country better. But anyways, go ahead.
I'm good. Thank you.
Do you want to add anything?
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, Paul, I'm going to bring in Yeukai now. Thank you for joining our fishbowl.
Thanks, everyone. It's a great discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I will bring in Yeukai with her question. Go ahead.
Hi.
Seriously not. All right.
Right. Thank you for a fascinating discussion. So I am a Zimbabwean citizen, and I've been living in America for the last 2-3 years now. And the discussion around American identity, American values, and how that the flag and who you vote for and which party you belong to is a reflection of your identity. And how both liberals and conservatives sort of want to, use sort of identity politics to say, this is what a patriotic, true American citizen is, and these are the true American values. Such that, there's a lot of polarization that comes with that. And we saw that similar in Zimbabwe, where there was this flag movement that started because African identity was pitched with liberalization politics. So if you are a true African citizen, you won't vote for the political party because they are pundits of the West. And a true African stands by the party that liberated Africans from the shackles of colonialism. And therefore, you've got a new generation of young people that is rising that don't understand liberation politics and are sort of identifying with new, have got, different identities that are not necessarily tied to the colonial past, and therefore are more inclined to follow the opposition, and have just taken the flag under this flag movement to say this flag is a symbol of a multifaceted society and identity that just not tied to colonialism and what a true African identity is. And I was just interested, to see in what ways both liberals and conservatives can find a way in which to have conversations that don't necessarily tie identity politics to the party, to who you vote for, because it seems like once there's that division already, and the way you speak about, say, if you're a true American, you behave in this way, or you act in this ways, and you vote for this person, it just doesn't bring space in which American citizens can unify and have social cohesion under one nation, one flag. It seems like they've got attached different meanings. I'm not sure if that's possible to, because it's such a multifaceted, country and with naturalized citizens. But in terms of how can we move forward, is it possible to move forward without identity politics, and tying them to elections and parties, and so yeah, interested to see perspectives around that.
Well, let me say a little something here, and I don't want to take too much of the time because I know we're short. America has always been diverse, but our levels of social cohesion have waxed and waned. And I suspect that the waxing and waning of social cohesion in countries and other parts of the world is also something that happens not necessarily independent of the different groups that are in society, but there are other factors driving it than just the diversity itself. And so I think that actually, over the course of this discussion, I've been really persuaded, or if not persuaded, certainly challenged by Professor Vamvakas's perspective. I was watching the movie Gandhi again recently, thinking about the tradition of nonviolence and the Indian independence movement. And there's this remarkable scene where he's brought to first address a crowd, and all these leaders of the Indian National Congress Party, which is the independence movement, are there giving speeches. And then he gets up and he says, "Nothing we say here matters at all, because the vast majority of Indians are living in a poverty that prevents them from having anything to do with you all. They don't care what a few lawyers in Bombay and Delhi think." Well, that's quite a speech for our independence movement. But I think what he got at was any attempt to unify people that does not understand the way of life of those people and the needs of those people on a day-to-day basis is bound to be left to a few professors or academics or things like that, and not penetrate into the lives of people who are the ones that need to be unified. So I think that effort for unification that comes from understanding people's way of life and what their needs are in a really visceral sense, I think that strikes me as the beginning of it.
I certainly have something to say, but I yield the floor because I don't want to take up the time. So.
Oh, no worries. I think those are very good questions. And Yeukai, thank you so much for joining. Because we have only 4 minutes left, I'm going to... Can
I just say one word to this?
Oh, of course,
yeah. Just one word. I think it's erroneous to think that there's systemic racism. I think there is systemic white supremacy. And to be thinking that the United States has always been this diverse country is wrong. The United States has all kinds of restrictions as far as the other that's non-European, all the way up to the 1960s. The United States did not start in 1968. The United States started, way back when. And if you look at what an American looks like in the World's Fair in Chicago in 1897, you can go see the characteristics. If you talk about eugenics, if you talk about the immigration policies of this country, there's a systemic white supremacy. There's an Anglo-Saxon creed that has been challenged fundamentally in the last 40 and 50 years. And everybody else is supposed to subscribe to it. Some of us can do it. Some of us can pass to it. Some of us can't pass. So I think in some ways we have to change our language in order for us to understand some of the things that we're talking about.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Yeukai. I'm going to bring in two people and try to combine the questions since we are 2 minutes away from our time. And maybe if anyone can stay, for an extra 5 minutes, that would be awesome. So I'll bring in Veronica and Neda right now. I'm going to promote Neda to panelist and Veronica as well. And you can start with your questions.
Hi. Sorry, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I know we're short on time, so I'll be very brief. Thank you, panelists, so much. I just wanted to ask a question that came out of last week's event, actually. One of the takeaways was that democratic institutions can't necessarily save us from further challenges because institutions are just made up of people, and people are subject to very polarizing environments. So my question is just related to the topic around the Supreme Court. And again, if any of the panelists have any suggestions or opinions basically about what role everyday citizens can or should be playing to try to bolster institutions, which should be independent institutions that are checks on some of these democratic challenges.
I can quickly elaborate on my question. It's a little bit different, but if anyone wants to get to it. My question, as Silas also responded to in the chat, was about how do you validate both existing experiences in the United States where you have a majority, a white supremacist majority, as Professor Vamvakas just said, that feels like they're being wronged in their grievances and that there's power that's being stripped from them, while also ignoring the moral equivalency that's occurred in escalating degrees since 2016. I think very viscerally to Charlottesville riots, when you had, on both sides, white supremacists and also people who were fighting white supremacy, and a desire to create a more fair and balanced narrative so that you don't constantly alienate a group of people. And to, I think it was Priya Kvam's point about calling people in versus calling people out, that's something that I have also had trainings and moderations on, and I completely agree. However, when you allow these people to even have a platform, you have what was a simmering white supremacy is now an executive office white supremacy. So how do you validate both of those experiences and not create a further erosion in what could possibly become a centrist democratic administration in the next few days that is trying to go back to what would be like a back to normal, back to moderate, back to institutions presidency. Thank you.
Thank you. And I have one more perspective before you get started, just to make it even more crazy and, fun in the fishbowl. I have Katie with us who can add another layer to Veronica's question, Nada's question.
Yes, I will try to be very brief. So with bringing whether it's seen as two different sides, two different ideologies together at the same table, with that moral equivalence problem of, okay, one side believes that as an LGBTQ person, I should not exist and I should not have civil rights and be able to participate in normal public activities. And then I have disdain for their hatred of me. Is it really fair to ask whether people identify as minority groups, targeted groups, etc.? Is it really fair to ask people like that, people like me, to, what, it's fine, your feelings don't really matter. We just need to bring these people in because otherwise they will elect leaders, they will support institutions that are inherently violent against people like me. So I'm just very curious about how you guys manage that when you're thinking about those conversations. How do you make sure that you're not re-victimizing or putting up people of color, LGBTQ people, as the emotional laborers for these people?
It's a really good question, and I'm so glad that you raised it and added that level of nuance. I think these are really pertinent to the work that we do at Breakthrough. I mentioned that we try to tell stories that reach both the Midwestern white suburban mom and also the gender nonconforming person of color in New York City. And we actually are releasing a video today, which is about the obstacles for trans and non-binary people when it comes to voting, the very real risks to safety and bodily integrity. And our goal with that is to share with fact-based information what people's lived experiences are, not only to validate them, but to create that safe space, recognizing that not everybody will get it. A lot of people will tune out, but there is a movable middle. And in that movable middle are people who haven't necessarily had a personal connection to somebody who is LGBTQ, who haven't necessarily thought about what it might be like to be in a voting line or be registering for your vote, given that you may have had to change your identity papers, that there is a lot of violence and post-traumatic stress that you might experience. That is not a part of some people's awareness. And so if we can bring it into focus, our goal is not to say that there is an equivalence between the people who disbelieve in the validity of your gender identity and sexual orientation and the way that you express who you are. Our goal is to show that people who have diverse identities also have common humanity. And so we don't want to give a space to anybody who could be causing harm. We do want to protect those spaces. And at the same time, we know that we can't have a conversation that moves forward unless there is a little bit of exposure. And again, personal storytelling. People respond to a story that is, deeply personal, that is nuanced, that is authentic. People are not responding to stories that are generic, because nobody's life is generic. And we want to make sure that we are reinforcing that these harms are real, that we also make sure that we hold the media accountable, because the media had a huge role to play in 2016 in terms of drawing false equivalences, between Hillary Clinton's emails and Trump's egregious behavior. We need to hold all media outlets accountable and make sure that they have an orientation towards inclusivity and human rights.
Thank you, Priya. And thank you, Veronica, Katie, and Netta for joining the Fishbowl. We are beyond time, but I just wanted to get final thoughts from everyone. I know Kavita said that one reaction she has is the work of the allies. Would you like to add any final insights to take away before we log off?
I didn't. I did want to go to, I think it was Nada's Supreme Court question. So just very, very quickly, I think, of course, the institutions we have are built on, they're not built on what we want them to be built on, right? However, given that that is what we have, I do think getting our people on the outside actually matters. And so I'll just leave it there.
Thank you. Silas?
So this may be a controversial point to end on, but I want to push a little bit here, because I felt like there was a similar theme in some of the last questions, which was about the danger of false equivalency. So I myself am a Democrat, just to put that out there, but the organization I work for is equally composed of Democrats and Republicans, and that's by design. I do not believe that there's moral equivalency between the policy preferences of those two parties in any way. But I also do believe that many of the things we believe about the other party and the people who support it are really mistaken. And the more I get to know people from the other side of this, the more I see that while some people do believe the most hateful things that I experienced in my life as a person of color, or that someone as an LGBTQ person might experience in their life, there's many, many people who those hateful things that are so central to what we just cannot tolerate have very little to do with their political preferences. And so disaggregating, or to use a less esoteric word, realizing that there's diversity within people who end up on the other side of the aisle is really important for both feeling like that it's not the whole world who's against us for our identity, and also for being able to bring some of those people in the direction that we believe that would be more positive or healthy for us and for the whole world. And so I guess that's my closing thought.
Thank you. And as I launch the final poll, Petros, any final words of wisdom for all of us here?
I don't know if I have words of wisdom. I have plenty of thoughts. I think things are going to get worse before they get any better. I think this COVID exercise that we're in, I think this is the third crisis in a row that has made us more insular and less democratic by nature. We have become the threat to each other fundamentally, and that will have implications politically and socially the September 11th, the crisis of 2008, and now this crisis has made us more and more individualistic. What we need is to work on solidarity and bridging a lot of these divides, and a lot of the identity politics are sort of like engineered to divide rather than to unify. So I think we have to restructure some of our language and our conversation and really find ways that we bridge and not become insular. I mean, I'm very scared of the fact that I have become a threat to everybody else's health around me unless I wear a mask or not wear a mask. And, you know, those, I mean, 9.5 million people die of starvation every year, 9.5 million. There are 225,000 Americans that died from this virus. And I know one single death means more than anything else. You know, I lost my mother last week, so I know how difficult that is, right? So I'm not devaluing life, but there's 9.5 million people that die every year of starvation. And there are all kinds of things that are going on. And I think we need to create those bridges of solidarity. Otherwise, we're going to be more and more in this, like, you know, this cycle of isolation and authoritarianism in the future.
Yes, thank you so much for your insights and sharing all your, you know, deeply personal views. And that's what really makes us bridge those solidarity gaps, that if we can talk to each other and try to understand each other more, and of course encourage everyone to vote, and then be more civically engaged beyond that, because that's just one of the things that we're doing. Thank you all so much for your insights, Silas, Priya, Kavita, and Petros. A huge thanks from Open Gov Hub and Global Integrity, and please take care of each other and your close ones as we close out this year, hopefully in better fashion than it started. Take care.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.